Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you're joining us from. This is Ann Grace from Safety Chain, and I'd like to welcome you to our Beyond Compliance webinar and podcast series. Today we have a special guest presenter, Carol Ptak, a partner at the Demand Driven Institute, who is going to be talking about the secrets to manufacturing operations in this post-COVID world. Quick note about Safety Chain before we get started. For those of you who don't know us, we offer solutions for food and beverage companies that range from production solutions, quality and food safety, and supplier compliance solutions. If you're not familiar with us, we would love for you to visit our website and check out one of our videos, or at least just have a look around. A few quick housekeeping tips before we dig in. This is an informal but professional format. We do encourage your questions. However, we'll probably hold those till the end. So please feel free to just go ahead and drop them in the questions box, and we'll get to them towards the end. If there's any questions that we're unable to take, we will be happy to get back with you after the webinar and respond to those. And we always get the question, will the recording link be shared? And the answer is yes, we will be posting those within 24 hours. If you have any issues with your audio, please try dialing in via phone rather than connecting over your computer audio. That usually does the trick. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Carol, partner at the Demand Driven Institute, who's going to talk about secrets to manufacturing operations in this post-COVID world. I would like to add, though, that today's topic is actually going to extend far beyond just a pure ops management talk, and it's going to focus on the even bigger picture of ROI and look at how manufacturers are going to need to think flexibly and run their operations fluently as we all begin to pick up the pieces from this immediate COVID intrusion into our lives, and as we look forward to sustainability and continued viability in the upcoming months. Carol has over 40 years experience in manufacturing. She is a celebrated speaker and author of many books, and she is a past APICS president and proudly the only woman to ever hold that position. So Carol, I'd like to welcome you. What are we going to be talking about today?
Thanks, Ann. I really appreciate the invitation today. Today we're going to be talking about several things. First, we're going to be talking about this crazy world that we're living in, and it's only gotten crazier with the COVID crisis. Then we're going to talk a little bit about some science, and then we're going to talk about the four-letter word that is the secret to this. So let's just jump right into it. What is this VUCA thing? You keep hearing in the media, we talk about the VUCA world. What is this? Is it, vacuum cleaners or what? But it's not. It's about being volatile. Some people say the V is for variable. It's volatile. A little match and can really set things off. And in addition to that, the U is for uncertain. We really don't know what's going on, and we have a really difficult time trying to see the future. Complex. For years, we thought about our businesses in terms of operations, a linear process where we have inputs that go in one side, outputs that go out the other side, and life is good. Except our supply chains are not linear. Our supply chains are very complex. They have a lot of things that are connected together. And so it's very important to understand that we've got to manage all these intricacies of this complex world. The last one, of course, is ambiguous. Not only can we not see the future, we really have a tough time sort of trying to figure out where we are presently. This has only gotten to be much worse during this COVID world as we've watched demand go absolutely crazy on some products and be normal on other products and decline on other products. So VUCA is our new normal. I've had an opportunity to talk to a lot of executives, and several of them asked me, when do you think we're going to get back to normal? And my answer to them is VUCA is our new normal. That as we compare to where we came from and where we're going, we're going to emerge into a world that we've never seen before. In much the same way, from 1965, we had a world that was very different than the world that we're managing today. So now, why did we pick 1965? Well, it's because today's supply chains are very different, but the problem is all of our rules, all of our tools, and all of our methodologies were developed in the 60s, codified in the 70s, commercialized by the late 1970, and guess what? They haven't changed. Back in 1965, you could send your child to the grocery store on a bike, and they had a choice of 2 toothpastes. You think about, there was one kind of tomatoes. You bought tomatoes. There wasn't Roma tomatoes and, hothouse tomatoes and all these different kind of packaging that we see today. Where today, especially in the food industry, you just go down the food aisle and it's gluten-free and it's fat-free and it's calorie-free and it's all these different kind of proliferation of stock keeping units. One company involved in the industry said that their volume hasn't changed over the last 4 years, but the number of SKUs that they're managing has quadrupled, has gone up by a factor of 4, which is really scary when you think about it, especially when you consider how our factories are laid out to be building very large batch sizes of the same thing over and over again. So here we've got this very volatile, variable new normal. And now let's add to that research that was done by Harvard. Harvard came out with this a couple years ago. This was before COVID. And it was very interesting what they had to say. They said that the mortality rate of a company is 6 times what it was just 40 years ago. Now, what's interesting is why. It's not because they didn't have great products. It's not because they didn't have wonderful suppliers or great technologies, or they had wonderful people. It's because the rate of change inside the company is less than the rate of change outside the company. And so companies really have 2 choices today. They can either choose to adapt, or what Harvard is saying, they're going to die. And that's really not a good choice to make. So you think about this study, they said 1 out of 3 American publicly held companies will cease to exist within 5 years. And I think COVID's going to help accelerate a number of those companies, much in the same way as when 9/11 happened in this country. It accelerated the demise of a number of different companies. So what are the risks that we need to be concerned about in this VUCA world? What are the risks that are going to topple us or cause us to no longer exist? Well, the first one is collapse. Where is it that's going to happen from outside or inside the industry that renders our whole firm's business model obsolete? Think of the Amazon effect. How about contagion? We get a shock in one area and it spreads to the rest of our business. Or let's talk a little bit about the one that we're currently in, the fat tail risk. Something rare, something this significant happened probably about 100 years ago with the 1917 flu, Spanish flu, but they do happen. There's 2 things that we know for sure. Is 1, we know it'll happen again. 2, we don't know when. So these fat tail risks are things that we need to be prepared for. They're rare, but they're significant. You go to the grocery store and you look on the shelves and you can see things that you wouldn't think of that would be in high demand were. Well, there's a discontinuity risk. Think about how businesses are evolving during the quarantine period and how these different business models are starting to evolve into this new post-COVID world. The next one is obsolescence. Consumers are changing their tastes, back to, especially in our food industry. It's you can buy a box of Cheerios now and it is now gluten-free, and then they talk about it's fat-free, high fiber, and you wonder, did they change the formula of Cheerios or has it always been that way? It's endorsed by the celiac industry. So you think about the impact on our food with the organic and the grass-fed and the other demands that consumers are putting on the products that we're building. And then the last one, of course, is rejection risk. What happens when participants in our system, and a good example of this was United Airlines several years ago, when the picture hit the news media of that passenger being dragged off the airplane, bloodied and yelling, and United Airlines financial results in that quarter just fell by 70%. So executives, these are the concerns that we have. These are not things that happen every day. This is not about scheduling the factory for tomorrow. So how do we assess the vital signs? What's important to our industry? What's important to our company? Well, first is working capital. What is the inventory, cash, and credit we have tied up in our company? The second is our contribution margin. What's our rate of generation of cash? A company can be very profitable and go out of business because it runs out of cash. The third is our customer base. If we're growing 20%, that sounds like great news, but if we're in a market that's growing 40%, we have a problem. Now, these are the organizational vital signs, the same way that a doctor would take our vital signs when we go in. We'd take our blood pressure, our pulse, our temperature, and as things are moving to an edge that we don't like, what happens is the alarms start to intensify and the reaction becomes very swift. If you go into the doctor and you've got a blood pressure of 240 over 165, I can bet you're going to be going immediately to the hospital. In the same way as we run our companies, we need to understand how our vital signs are running and how is it that how okay and how not okay we are, because our vital signs change over time, just like our blood pressure or our temperature. So what we must do is we need to know how okay or how not okay we are. Our systems that were developed in the 1960s were based on a linear system that came out of operations. So we only knew using standardized MRP if we're okay or not okay. Well, what we're really managing today in our business is what's called a complex adaptive system. So why do we call it complex? Well, it's nonlinear. We're back to that complex in the VUCA world. There's a lot of interdependencies. There's a lot of multi-echelon, multi-dimensional structures, which means that there's an interesting phenomenon that happens. There's an extreme sensitivity. So a small event someplace can produce a big event someplace else. This is called the butterfly effect, which means that we get this very disproportionate cause and effect. A small thing can cause an enormous impact. I mean, think about our highly automated lines. A tiny little thing can cause that line to come down. Now, why do we call it adaptive? Adaptive is because of the way this system works. Now, this comes out of the field of biology. In biology, they did the work on the theory of adaptation. He never called it the theory of evolution. It was the theory of adaptation. In the natural world, there are genetic mutations that then nature judges. Well, nature is sort of a tough judge because if the mutation gives you an advantage, you survive. If the mutation does not give you an advantage, then you die. So it's called emergence, selection, and feedback. So what happens is that there's something that emerges, a new idea, something that changes. And the feedback tells us how we're doing. And the selection in nature is survival or not. In the business world, it's the decisions that we make and how is it that we move forward. So it's complex, adaptive, and systemic. Not systems as in computer systems, but systemic, and looking at all those connections that we have to manage. So what are the key attributes? If I've got a lot of things that I need to manage, the key is that I want coherence. Now, what is coherence? Coherence is that ability to keep everything in line so that we're all pulling towards the same goal. So that means that we need to understand what the boundary of that systemic system is and what does that edge of chaos look like? All right, because this is where equilibrium and chaos collide. Every system is trying to get to less and less organization. So now, how do we know where we're at in that continuum? That's where we need the signals. And that as things get worse, we need a stronger signal. Not just a red light that goes on or goes off. We need to know how are we doing along that continuum. And then finally, the feedback loops. This has got to be a closed loop system. Something that we've known for years of plan, do, check, act, or define, measure, analyze, improve, control, DMAIC. Something that we use every day in our manufacturing systems, but it also has to be in how we manage our business systems. And of course, what's the most important? The adaptive agents, which is just a fancy name for people. That's how do we translate the signals that we've been given to manage this systemic group that we're trying to manage. So how do we measure success? Well, success at the end of the day is measured by return on investment. And how we get there is through resilience. And you're hearing a lot of discussion around resilience of supply chains in the news media these days. And it's that ability to maintain or restore system equilibrium. So how do we do that? Well, let's get back to, and we're going to focus on coherence. But what is it that we want coherence to? What is that secret that allows us to be able to manage, especially a food products company, in this COVID world? Well, it's something that we actually know something quite a bit about, which is flow. It's a little four-letter word. All right, we know about it. We've learned a lot about it. And what was interesting is one of the founders of MRP, Material Requirements Planning, George Plazel, every time I heard him speak, he always said, all benefits are directly related to the speed of flow. Now, what happens when I have good flow? When flow is occurring, I know I have good service, don't I? Because if things are flowing well, I'm giving the customer what they want when they want it. Well, if the customers are getting what they want when they want it, well, then I have good revenue. Now, what's the next thing? Well, everybody that understands anything about flow knows that as I have better flow, I have less inventory. Still waters run deep, as the story goes. But now let's step back and look at that. What is it that we've been told, especially in consumer products, for years? We call this a deep truth. A deep truth is something that absolutely everybody knows and believes and is absolutely and unequivocally false. And you might say, well, Carol, how could the whole world be wrong? Well, it's not the first time. I mean, remember when we thought that the earth was flat or that the earth was the center of the universe? Of course, if you talk to your teenagers, they still think that, but the earth was not the center of the universe. And when Copernicus and Galileo started to look further and see data and started to do the analysis, they realized that the earth was not the center of the universe. And it changed a lot of things. It changed a lot of religions and social structures and government structures. So what is this when we look in terms of our process, our planning processes? Well, what have we been always told? To have better customer service, I have to have more inventory. So how can you say to me that if I focus on flow, I get better service with lower inventories? Don't I need bigger safety stocks? Well, the answer is no, because as I have better flow, what happens is I get better service with better revenue, with lower inventories, with lower expense, all at the same time. And it's really interesting to go to the grocery store right now to look at the impact of the food products manufacturers. What were the first products to restore to the shelves that were empty? And of course, it was the fresh products. It was the products like meat and produce. And why? Because they have a faster flow. What's still struggling to fill the shelves back up is the non-perishable products, the toilet paper, the paper towel, the disinfectant wipes. So because the customers, the people that are building our fresh foods know they have to be close to their market, and flow has to be fast because they've got expirations they have to deal with. Now, the last point here is cash flow. As I improve flow and I get better service, I get better revenue, I get lower inventories, I get lower expenses, another thing happens. I get better cash flow. So the rate of our cash generation follows our product to demand. Well, that's good. So if I get all those things, what do I get? I talk to a lot of executives around the world and I ask them, what's your goal? And they look at me like I'm crazy. And they said, well, to make money, of course. I say, really? Is that your objective? I said, if I make $250,000 last year, did I do well? And they go, well, I don't know. It depends. I said, well, if it depends, then that's not the goal. And they said, well, if I made 250,000, I invested 10 billion, did I do well? Oh, no, that's not good at all. But if I invested $1,000 and I get $250,000, I did very well. So I would submit to you that our objective for our company is not profitability. It's really all about return on investment. So let's dive a little bit more into that connection between flow and return on investment. So we all know that Dr. Deming said, I can only improve that which I can measure. So how do I measure flow? Flow is the rate at which a system produces product required by a customer. If it's still here, it's not flow. Now, here's the key thing. What do we tend to do in the food industry is when I end up with a lot of excess inventory, I do promotions. And what's promotions? selling more product at a lower price. Buy one, get two free. That's because we ended up with a lot of inventory. Now, what's the next thing we're going to look at? We're going to also look at the velocity of cash. And what's cash velocity? We're going to look at net cash generation, revenue minus variable expense minus our period operating expense. Notice there's no allocation of overhead. That's because when we're making an operational or tactical decision, those fixed costs, well, they're fixed. So therefore, they're not relevant. So what's the overall metric we want? We want net profit divided by investment. And that is and always has been the equation for return on investment. Now you can get further into depth with that with the DuPont ROI model, but that's good enough. Net profit divided by investment. So now let's start to take a look at and how do we quantify flow? This is called Little's Law. If I look at my output per day times my lead time, that'll give me my work in process. Or I can start to have some fun with the formula, and my work in process divided by my throughput is my lead time. And what I know is the shorter I have my lead time, the better flow I get. Now, flow also impacts our company vital signs. It's a direct contributor to working capital because of the lower working capital that's required at lower inventory, our customer base because our customers happier with things that move faster, and of course our contribution margin. And here's the biggest truth of all. As you promote flow, costs are better controlled. As you focus on cost, you will destroy flow. Now, we've been at this about 20 minutes, and I probably haven't told you anything new. And you're really starting to wonder why Ann invited me on. Well, we must be missing something. If it's so obvious, then why isn't the whole world focused around flow? And for many years, we heard about the lean folks saying, well, you need to use one and produce one. Well, it's just not possible in our industry, is it? We've got minimum order quantities that we have to deal with. All right, we've got big machines we got to deal with. But that doesn't mean that we can't focus on flow. So we got to be missing something. What are we missing? What's public enemy number one for flow? It's variability. Well, what's variability? It's the difference between what we thought was going to happen and what happens. As variability goes down, flow goes up. As variability goes up, flow goes down. Now, is that all there is to it? Well, we definitely have a lot of variability, don't we? So how do I manage that variability? Well, I manage that variability with visibility. Now, how do we define that? Visibility, very clearly defined as relevant information. And notice those big capital bold words, relevant information. Not all materials, not all information is relevant. As I get better visibility, my variability goes down. As my visibility goes down, my variability goes up. I was born and raised in Buffalo, New York, and I'll tell you about blizzards. And when you have a whiteout, you're not driving real fast because you have zero visibility. It's the same is true today in Arizona with sandstorms. So the better visibility that I have, the better flow I get. So what really is our collective supply chain problem that we need to solve? Well, it's really simple, and it's actually been written about since about 1962. Back in 1962, a gentleman named Jay Forrester was writing about what he called the Forrester effect. Well, we call it the bullwhip effect today, and what we know is that small changes on one side lead to big changes on the other side. And what comes as a surprise to a lot of people is it is bidirectional. Not only is there variability coming from demand to supply, there's also variability coming from supply to demand. And so the more things we connect together, the worse our problem is. Let's take a look at a quick example. As you look at our example here, you notice our objective at the top is we all want to successfully manage our supply chains. That's become ever more evident during the COVID virus. This whole crisis is that more and more people are talking about what is a supply chain and why is it so important? Well, in order to successfully manage our supply chain, we have to effectively manage our cash and effectively maintain our high customer service level. Think about all those empty shelves in the grocery store. Had there been inventory there, the stores could have sold more. So I want to raise my inventories. But if I do that, then I've impeded my cash. If I lower my inventories, then I've impeded my high customer service. Because of this belief that we have is to have high customer service, I got to have high inventories. So what do? We oscillate. We stand on one foot and then we stand on the other foot. So on one side, we'll raise inventories until what happens? We get finished inventory goods go up. We get lots and lots of overtime. We get lots of work in process. Our space becomes constrained. Our manufacturing floor becomes cluttered. And especially in our food industry, what happens? We have to worry about things like expiration dates. We just can't put it on the shelf and forget it. That thing's got an expiration date to it. Now, then what do? Well, usually what happens is then we emphasize that one side until we can't stand it anymore and we flip to the other side. And usually with a change of managers, right? We get a new manager in and says, I'm going to lower inventories. And we continue to lower inventories until what happens? Well, we start to miss shipments. We're working overtime. We're not obeying our full truckload policies. Now we're putting out partial LTL trucks and we're having difficulty getting them. So then what do? We flip back to the other side. We add inventory. So let's take a step back and look at inventory. See if you'll agree with me. Can you have too little inventory? And of course we can have too little inventory. It's called shortages, right? Well, can we have too much inventory? Well, of course we can have too much. Now, this is where I always love, I do a lot of traveling. I spend a lot of time at the airport. And on the way between my house and the airport is my mom's house. I always stop by and see mom on my way out. Mom's 90 years old. And every time I go, my mother has to ask the same question. How come you have to go? You got people all around the world that can do this. How come you got to go? And I always tell her, so Mom, I tell really smart people really profound things in a very funny accent. To which Mom always laughs and she says, but you don't have an accent. Well, Mom, when you're standing in Moscow with 34 Russians in the room, trust me, you're the one with the accent. So if too little is a bad thing, too much is a bad thing, here it is. There's the profound statement. Somewhere between too little and too much is just right. I love my job. Well, how do we measure just right? What is that optimal range? That optimal range, that dashed blue line, is return on investment. Where is it that I can maximize my ROI? Now let's lay over this our traditional planning process. In traditional planning, an MRP does not fit food products at all. All right, this is why our planners do what? They export all the data into an Excel spreadsheet and they try to manipulate it to figure out what is real. So what happens is we end up with too much of the wrong stuff, too little of the right stuff, overall too much stuff. And every time I plan, I flip from too much to too little and too little to too much. And guess what? In our research, over 90% of companies reported this issue. That's pretty scary. So here's our big question, okay? This is the question that we ask. What and how do we gain visibility to relevant information? Today, we're drowning in data and we're starving for information. There's lots of tech companies out there saying all we got to do is embrace Internet of Things, Industry 4.0, all this technology that's going to more tightly connect things together. And in fact, what we know, if we do that, bullwhip is going to get worse and worse, and we're going to tear our supply chains apart. Not all information is relevant. How do we get visibility to relevant information in this crazy COVID and post-COVID world, in this VUCA environment, in order that we can focus on flow? Is it even possible? Well, if it wasn't possible, we'd be done by now, and we're not. So let's get into that. What are the 4 prerequisites that we have for relevant information? Well, the first one is that we need to understand what is the relevant range that we are managing. Now, we're going to get into each of these, but what's that relevant range? The second point is how do I implement a flow-based operating model? There's been lots of flow-based models that have been proposed over the years, but how do I implement a flow-based operating model in a food products company? Third, how do I get tactical reconciliation between those ranges? And fourth, how do I have metrics that help me understand where is it that I need to focus? How okay and how not okay am I? So now let's start to look at each one of these just for a couple minutes each. The first one, relevant ranges. What is a relevant range? Well, a relevant range is defined as the time frame within which the assumptions are valid. Because now let's think about that. Operationally, we have short-term information. Now, strategically, we're looking at those mountains. Okay, operational is looking on the hills. So that time frame within which those assumptions are valid. Now, the assumptions and information between those time ranges are going to be different. When I try to force fit assumptions into the wrong time range, that distorts my information. For example, let's talk about forecast, one of our favorites, right? One of the consumer products companies in South Korea said outside of 2 months, their forecast accuracy drops to 10% because of consumer variability. So using forecasts for operational planning is a disaster. But forecasts are absolutely relevant in the long range. Another one is fixed cost. The cost of the factory and the plant and the people is fixed, and it's relevant in the long range, not in the short range. A work order delay, however, is very relevant in the short range, but not in the long range. Machine breakdown, relevant in the short range, not in the long range. So different relevant ranges are typically used by different people. The operations folks are looking at those near-term hills, and the executives are telling us we need to get ready to climb the mountains. And the ops people are saying, those aren't mountains, those are hills. Well, the executives are looking way out into that future. They're looking at a different relevant range. So now let's look at the second component, the flow-based operating model. We've talked a little bit about flow already. Now, did Demand-Driven Institute invent flow? Of course not. Demand-Driven Institute is not a consulting company. We are not a software company, nor have we ever done consulting, or we have never run software. We're a think tank. All we have to talk about is maybe thinking about our supply chains in a different way. Flow's been supported by a lot of other people, economics, mathematics, physics, management, George Plazel from MRP, Ellie Goldratt from Theory of Constraints, Taiichi Ohno from Lean. But there's a very specific way to design that flow-based operating model. The one on the bottom is a discrete manufacturing company. That's not you, right? That's a discrete company. They're making to order. You know, if you're in food products, you're standing in the grocery store, you're not going to stand there and wait for the cow. You expect that milk to be on the shelf. The upper one is a food products company. That's a consumer packaged goods. All right, now you can see how it's configured is very different than the discrete manufacturing, not only in how we do our planning, but also in how we configure our flow-based operating model. Now, how do we do this tactical reconciliation? As we talked about, our assumptions and informations vary between our relevant ranges, and we need to constantly reconcile them bidirectionally and iteratively. Strategy's got to be influenced by our operational capability, and operational capability must be influenced by our strategy. Now, as Ann said when she introduced me, I used to be a professor at a university for several years after my last position where I was vice president and global industry executive at PeopleSoft. I always used to teach my students that their only source of sustainable competitive advantage is to exploit their unique operational capability that provides value to the customer at a profit to yourself. That's it. That's the only thing that's sustainable. Now let's look at flow-based metrics. How you measure me is how I will behave. So those flow-based metrics have to take into account those other three prerequisites. It has to fit the range. It's got to fit our operating model. It has to be reconcilable. And when I attempt to force fit non-flow based metrics, that leads to conflicts. This is the problem with balanced scorecards. It's right in the name, balance. Somehow if we can find a spot between the conflicts, maybe we can last long enough. Well, that's not a good thing for your folks, right? You're putting them in conflict with themselves. You're putting them in conflict with the company. Now, how do we get out of this? Well, it's something we call the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. It's got three pieces to it. The first piece is coming out of adaptive S&OP, and that's the business plan. Now, business plans tend to be done in ranges. So we're going to be looking at parameters. Out of the DDS and OP process comes our model configuration, not a master schedule. Master settings that determine the capability and operations so that we can build what we can and will sell, as opposed to a master schedule that says, what is it that I can and will build, which leads to lots of promotions and lots of excess inventory. Now, out of DDS and OP, since I can convert strategy to operations, I now can convert operational capability to strategy. Notice that each one of these is a closed loop, that it's a plan, do, check, act, or a DMAIC loop. Now, what does it connect? It connects our company. Remember that boundary? That boundary around our system, our supply chain. So we connect to actual demand on one side, and we connect to our market-driven innovation. Where do we want to drive the company on the other side? We're no longer a victim of what's going on around us. Now we can establish where it is that we want to go and determine operationally what is the capability that's required for us to get there. So now let's take a look at those 4 prerequisites for relevant information. Well, first, let's look at the relevant ranges. All right. So first, let's look at that operational demand-driven operating model there on the left. Well, that manages the operation side. This is what we do this minute, this hour, today, this week. It's a very short lead time. Okay, it's up to the longest decoupled lead time. And we're going to talk about what that is in a minute. The next, the tactical. Well, that's where I look backwards and I look forwards. And this is where I do my rough cut capacity planning. It's where I do my rough cut scheduling. And then, of course, strategically, I have to look at the cumulative lead time and beyond. Now, this goes out much further than what traditionally people have thought of in terms of S&OP. You know, as I travel around the world and I ask people, how long should we look out for S&OP? The typical answer I get is 15 to 18 months. Well, part of that's true. And as you can see here, that S&OP has to help us create our annual business plan. It's not quite as long as our strategic planning, but it has to go out to where our capacity and our costs become variable, because I have to have that visibility to know when I need to add capacity. Now let's get back to this flow-based operating model. Well, it's not about, I call the war of or. We either did lean, or we did TOC, or we did factory physics, or we did Six Sigma. It's about the land of and. We want to pace our operations to what our customers actually want to do, because we recognize that's best for our cash flow. But we can't build one and sell one. Good heavens, we're in the food products industry, right? We have batches. So that means that we have to create firewalls in our supply chain. Firewalls don't prevent a fire from happening, but it does prevent the fire from burning down the whole building. So we do this in demand-driven by strategically placing decoupling points. What that does is it compresses our lead time to our customers. It absorbs variability from both sides. It provides our primary position for planning, and it improves return on investment, or we don't put it there. Now, the next thing we have to do is control points. This is how we synchronize our schedule. And the last thing is we have to protect it. Depending on the operating model that we're building, depends on how much buffer we need. Now, buffers can be inventory, buffers can be time, or buffers can be capacity. It all depends on how our production operations put together. Typically in a food products industry, you know, we try to do postponement as much as possible. You know, we package things up in brights, and then we label to order. So let's look at the flow-based operating model in a little bit more detail. Well, it's in 3 pieces. The first piece you might have heard about, and it's called DDMRP, Demand-Driven Material Requirements Planning. And unlike what some people have written about it, it's not just MRP with DD in front of it. It is a new supply order generation that releases orders out to scheduling, as well as purchase orders and stock transfer orders out for buffer management. You can see that each one of these legs is closed loop. All right, there's a feedback loop. Well, the whole process has to be overseen, because the whole process needs to adapt based on what's going on in the marketplace. It's not set it and forget it. All right, we set it and we adapt it because we're living in this VUCA world. We have to deal with the variability, the volatility, the uncertainty. And everybody always likes to ask, how do I precisely calculate a buffer? And the answer is if you can precisely calculate a buffer, you don't need the buffer. All right, so it's about being roughly right and establishing operational capability so that I can build what I can and will sell, so that I'm leveraging my resources to build only those things that are going to sell. Think about if the stores could have kept their shelves full during this whole quarantine that we've been on. Now, DDSNOP overlooks this flow-based operating model. Now, how does that work? How does that tactical reconciliation work? It's bi-directional. It connects our strategic relevant range of adaptive SNOP to the operating model. That's why the logo is both blue and gold. The gold side is where we make money. The blue side is the blue sky of strategy. Remember, on the strategic relevant range side, it is critically important we must forecast. It's our only way of taking our best guess. But the difference is we only need to forecast at the product family level. The demand-driven operating model helps and handles the operational side so that we're replenishing those strategically chosen stock buffers based on actual consumption. Now, what's more important is that now the factory now gets a stable schedule so that we can do what's very common in food products, which is be able to schedule in sequential order. It moves us from transactional control to process control. So there's a tactical review of how we have been operating in the past so that we can understand, are we within our control limits? The same way as we fill our containers or look for our portion sizes, we can now run our operations. We also can look at the tactical projections. How do I project how well that model is going to work within that tactical range? The tactical range is looking out one cumulative lead time. Where do I have surges in load? Where is it that I have valleys? Right? Do I have to do some what's called tactical exploitation? Where can I promise to bring in new things? The next one is, how is it that I adapt that model? It's not a master schedule, it's master settings. So I'm going to configure and shape that model to the evolving environment. This creates a great deal of stability for the factory because we're operating now in ranges. Now, tactical exploitation, we get to see when we unload the shop floor from building all the things that we don't need to building the things that we can sell, where we have real capacity left over. How can I sell that so that I can generate more return on investment? And this is really critically important. This is where I can use a promotion and generate significant ROI. This is where the great ideas come from. Sometimes where the constraint is in our operation is something that's really not that big of a deal, and we need to make some recommendations to senior managers to approve maybe a capital investment that can improve the output of the plant by 20 or 30%. Now, finally, we need to be able to project the models that the senior executives are giving us. So how is it that we can look at the different business plan scenarios and say, here's the implication from an operational perspective. You know, this is what we're going to need in working capital. And instead of sitting there and saying, well, we can't do that, which senior executives don't want to hear, we can now say, that's a choice. Now, let me give you what the consequence of that choice is. So remember, our business plans are in ranges. We have a most expected, we have a high side, we have a low side. That's usually done in a forecast. If we go high, that's safety that we require. If we have low, well, then we need to understand what our maximum exposure is going to be in terms of inventory working capital. So this all comes out in the buffers as a stock buffer. So we can look at these projected scenarios and we can see that the red zone in the buffer is not safety stock, it's the safety embedded in the buffer. It is a primary position of inventory. That primary position of inventory allows me to absorb variability. Unlike how safety stock works, where it accelerates an order, usually an order that's past due for release, it allows us to respond to what is real. Now, I can look at this in terms of inventory to make sure that my capability of my inventory, my working capital fits within my business plan. I can also take a look at this in terms of capacity. Because remember, that strategic relevant range, I have to look out to where capacity and cost are variable. Okay, so this is really important. So I need to know lead time away that we need this new capacity so that we can respond. And what's going to be the impact to inventory when I had the capacity before the demand catches up to where the additional capacity was required. Now let's go back to where we started. We talked a bit about complex adaptive systems. Anytime you've seen anything about complex adaptive systems, you'll see this kind of a diagram. And what this diagram is you'll see that it's almost like an infinity loop. You've got emergence, selection, and feedback on the strategic adaptive side, and we have emergence, selection, and feedback on the tactical side. Well, the two have to feed each other. It has to be bi-directional, and that's the goal, and that's the role of DDS and OP. It's a bi-directional tactical reconciliation that connects the strategic adaptive loop with the tactical adaptive loop. And it's a continuous improvement process, just like quality. So how do we keep this whole thing going? Well, it's having the right measures. Remember, it's not a balanced scorecard. Balanced scorecards are some of the worst things you can do to a company because it forces us into conflict. Measures should neither be a source of, nor should they exacerbate variability, because variability is public enemy number one of flow. So let's take a look at the operational metrics. What do I start doing, stop doing, continue doing? Reliability, stability, and speed. Those three are necessary and sufficient for our tactical metrics, where now we're managing with process control. We're looking for tactical improvement, waste reduction, expense control, tactical contribution. Well, if I have my process control, just like my processes when my fillers and my portion sizes, well, that gives me better strategic advantage because that's going to maximize my contribution margin, my working capital, and my customers are going to be much happier. So the flow-based metrics bring coherence, and that coherence is all about flow. If there's one thing that you remember about this webinar today is please remember it's all about flow. If you want to follow my Twitter feed, that is actually my Twitter handle at it's all about flow. So now let's look at the DDAE model. It was built on complex adaptive systems. It was built for flow. What's the result? A highly resilient supply chain. And I've talked to a lot of the execs that have implemented demand driven before the COVID crisis. And a number of them have said, our buffers are holding. It is amazing how much variability we've been able to withstand with buffers that were not sized for anything of what we're seeing. So this is all about resiliency. It is that ability to get back to whatever that new normal is going to be. So you're probably asking yourself the question at this point, well, how do I get started? What's the first step? Well, the first step is first understanding where are we today? And right now, today, we're trapped. We're trapped in the cost world. We're trapped in this oscillation between cost and performance. So it's taking that first step, going to stage 2, understanding it is all about flow, doing a pilot in your company so that you can determine if it works, if these ideas work for you. Please don't take my word for it. It always drove me crazy when I was a plant manager and somebody would say, well, just trust me, it works. Please don't trust me. I wrote the book. I know it works. Get you and your staff educated and try a proof of concept pilot. That's a stage 2. Some companies, once they get the education, go straight to a DDAE level 1. This is the first place you can be called demand driven. This is a company that has a full demand-driven operating model in place. Means that it has the planning, the order release engine, DDMRP, plus buffer management, plus scheduling. So those 3 components make up that demand-driven operating model. Now, once you get the operating model set, you're going to get some great results. Well, then you need to start to adapt it. Because as you start to change manufacturing, and manufacturing starts to see stable schedules, then they're going to be more responsive to the marketplace. So then you can move to a DDAE level 2, which is now where we drop in S&OP. And then finally, where we want to get to is the DDAE level 3. What are the 3 key words here? We need to sense, adapt, and innovate. And this is now where you can start to drive changes in your industry. Because in your industry, you are in equilibrium based on your cost, based on your lead time, and based on your customer service. When you start to dramatically shift one of those, you can change the entire industry. So by simply going to stage 2, let's do that proof of concept pilot. What can we expect? Are we going to get 1 or 2% improvement? Well, actually, no, you're not. Typically what happens is customer service typically will go up to about 97 to 100%. One consumer products company, a food company up in Toronto, improved from, they had like 91%, they went up to 99.7%. They also reduced their lead time. This is quite common. Their response time to the market went from 70 days, 70 days, to 9 days. So imagine how you could respond to your market if now from the time the consumer pulls it off the shelf to you're building it in your factory is now 9 days. Now, the other thing that happens at the same time is typically inventory will go down about a third to a half. In this consumer product company, it was a food company up in Toronto, their finished goods went down 43%, raw materials came down 23%. Now, what happens with cost? Everybody says we care about cost, and of course we do too. But I care more about expenses, and I'm looking for cash. Well, what ends up happening is because you're not breaking in and doing all those crazy schedule break-ins because something is short in the marketplace, your overall expenses go down. And the other thing is the planners that go through it, they love this stuff because it's intuitive. They no longer have to export things to Excel to try to figure out, well, what just happened? And you can see some of the companies there that have been on the journey with us. I'm going to highlight a couple companies here. Ninewood is an American company. Everybody always asks about the level 5 company. Ninewood would be one of those companies. You can see that their visibility is improved, their variability is improved, which means their flow is increased. And what they discovered is that when they stop building what they don't need, they actually discovered about 20 to 30% excess capacity without adding any machines. The cost came down, and also their headcount came down through attrition. They did not lay anybody off. And you can see their rework tickets, how they came down. And you can see down in the lower left-hand corner, their reliability has gone up. Their on time and full is basically at 100%, which now in their market, they turn to competitive advantage. They can guarantee and they have a penalty if they don't deliver what they're supposed to when they're supposed to. They're also highly resilient. They happen to be in Oregon, and in Oregon had a horrible, horrible snowstorm, and it was amazing to them how fast they could recover when that snowstorm hit. The most important thing I think on this whole thing and the good summary of this is we started to talk about ROI. Is you look at volume and value. That green line is critically important. That's your margin per flow unit. That's looking at how much contribution margin you're making per capacity constraint. Now let's look at another company, Heavy Process, just like you are, down in Colombia. And you'll notice as this thing builds, something happened here, all right? And you're going to say, well, okay, this makes sense. On time and full and working capital, yep, they should track together. And you can see these coming up. But then all of a sudden, you see a divergent point. And all of a sudden, the two split. On time and full goes up, and working capital goes down. And always the question is, well, what happened there? And that was their DDMRP proof of concept pilot. And you can see the divergence between those two. Dramatic improvement of ROI for this company. All right, so these closing minutes, let's think about a final thought. What is the final thought? Please invest in your people. It has to be thoughtware before hardware and software. Before you invest in technology, invest in your people. If they can't think systemically, then they cannot think in terms of flow. You have to consider what is going on in the overall supply chain. and ensuring and maintaining the framework for the 4 prerequisites: the relevant ranges, the bidirectional tactical reconciliation, the demand-driven operating model, and the flow-based metrics really is the job of management. They're the ones that establish the system. That's what we have for you today. I know I've thrown an awful lot at you in a single hour. You've gotten hit with a lot. We knew this was going to be a big fire hose. What I'll leave you with here is I'll leave you with my email, and I'll leave you with our website. If you are interested in getting more education about this methodology, please visit our website. I don't have anything to sell you. As I said, we're not consultants. We're not software. The only thing that I can offer you is a different way to think. That's what I have for you today. Ann, do we have any questions that have popped up?
We do, Carol, and we'll get to those in just a minute. I wanted to take the opportunity to thank you very much for coming on the show today. This is a very critical time for food manufacturers, and you certainly have given them a lot to think about. Would you like to field the first question?
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, we've got a good question that just came in from Kansas, and the question was, how soon do we typically see results? Well, that's interesting. That company that I was telling you about, that they reduced their finished goods by 45%, raw materials down 23%, that lead time reduction of 70 days to 9 days. This is a company that spent 3 years in simulation to try to figure out how is it that this might apply to their company. They finally decided to go ahead and implement the initial pilot in a plant they were going to close anyway because they were moving manufacturing to a different factory. And so they figured they'd try it. They got those results in 8 weeks. 8 weeks. After 3 years of simulation, in 8 weeks, they got those results. So that's very common. I was at a big conference and I had a big software company executive next to me listening to some of the results from the first case study, another consumer products company. And he leaned forward, he said, "That's amazing." And I looked at him, I said, "You do realize that's average, right?" He's like, "You're kidding." He said, "We've done MEIO implementations, multi-echelon inventory optimization." And he says, we're real happy if we can get a 2 to 5% reduction in inventory. I said, for demand driven, that's sort of a rounding error. So that was very interesting. Oh, good. We got another question that just came in from Florida. The good question is that how can I get my people educated, when everybody's home on quarantine, or I've got a lot of people home on quarantine. And that's where, we've left the website open for you there. There are some self-study bundles that you might want to consider for your folks to get them started so that when you come back, it's a very quick transformation. So I'm really concerned about American industry because unfortunately with the demand-driven methodologies, America is really lacking and is really falling way behind. It's sort of like the automotive industry during the lean times, is that Japan really led the way. And what's interesting is in the demand-driven methodology, you would never believe it, but the country that is absolutely leading the way in education and methodology and implementations is France. It's over in Europe, is in France. And second is Colombia, which is really quite fascinating. And third is Mexico. So come on, America, we need to get on the stick here and catch up. It's a way that we can learn how to sense those changes in the marketplace and learn how to adapt, because we most certainly don't want that other alternative. Ann?
I guess in closing, I would just like to encourage everyone to reach out to Carol either via email or her website, especially with people working from home. A lot of companies feeling like things are being stalled. There's no better solution than to start thinking about new ways to adapt to these changes. And you've got some great opportunities for people to dig in there, and you've certainly given them a lot of food for thought. I'd also like to invite everybody to visit the Safety Chain website. We do have a lot of interesting content on there, content downloads, webinars to revisit, and we'd always be happy to do a solution consultation for you if you're interested in adding some technology that can also help to reduce lead times and help you with your yields, et cetera. So I guess in closing, thank you very much. And we look forward to having you back on another Beyond Compliance webinar in the future.
Thanks. I sure appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thanks, Carol.